Please go ahead.
Okay. Today we listen to the third talk of the Madras month. The topic is somewhat new. About vaccinations in Chennai 200 years ago. Smallpox was rampant. The public was doubtful about the vaccinations being pushed by the government. Maybe particularly because the smallpox vaccination had something to do with cowpox. It was said that those who got infected with cowpox were immune to smallpox. The British government ruling India then gave incentives both to the public and to the vaccinators to ensure that the vaccination drive was a success. Our own Historian V Sriram will talk to us about this little known episode in the history of Madras. Sriram specializes in little known facts and anecdotes. He's an entrepreneur, music critic, city historian, and heritage activist. He's a prolific author and has written more than 20 books on music, Chennai history, and corporate India, picking up several awards on the way. He's the editor of Madras Musings, a secretary of the Music Academy, pioneer in heritage walks and tours, and a key organizer of the Madras Week celebrations in the city. What makes him a household name in Madras, however, is his genius as a public speaker. He can entertain any audience, not just on music or Chennai heritage, his famous areas of expertise, but on any subject that engages him. We are delighted to listen to him once more. Over to Sriram.
Thank you, Sandilya. Thank you, Presidents Ranjit and Renu, for inviting me to speak today. I think, Sandy, this must have been the most serious conversation that you and I have ever had. At least, for the sake of the public, we must put up this image. So thank you, Rotarian Sandilya, for this wonderful.
Absolutely welcome. It's very difficult for me, as you can imagine, but I managed it.
Yeah. Anyway, with great difficulty, I was controlling my laughter here when I heard you reeling out all those things about me. But I will now go on to share my screen, and I just host disabled participant screen sharing. So can somebody enable it for me, please?
Yeah, it's being done.
Yeah. Thank you. It's now enabled. I guess you can see the slide. I'll just go on to slideshow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as Sandy said in the introduction, this presentation deals with the arrival of vaccination for the first time in our city. And the proposition with which I'm making this presentation to you is, as you go along, you will realize that things haven't changed in the past 219 years since the arrival of the first vaccine. Whether it is the behavior of the public, or whether it's the behavior of those who make the laws, the kind of rumor mongering and fear mongering that goes around, things have more or less remained the same in the last so many years. It's just that the population has multiplied several times, and therefore it becomes a bigger logistical nightmare. And the other thing is that at that point of time, I think it was an era when the government could take its time to vaccinate people. Death statistics were not something that governments were very greatly worried about at that point of time. Today, these things have become very important, and therefore there is a lot of pressure on vaccination. But then, as now, the story reels out in a very, very similar fashion. I request that if you can get people to mute themselves.
Mute everybody, and then Sriram can unmute himself. Thank you.
Yeah.
Suresh Arunachalam must mute himself.
Okay. I've just put up this map by way of introduction. Today, we are looking at the pandemic of the COVID. Now, this is a map that was put together sometime in 1977, and it traces to you the years in which various countries of the world eradicated smallpox by decade. And what it shows you is that smallpox was all over the world. There was no country that was immune to smallpox. In its time, it was the pandemic of the world. And while we are talking about getting rid of a pandemic in 2 years and 3 years, this was there from time immemorial. And it continued, it spread from continent to continent. People carried it wherever they went. And when it attacked, there was no cure. Most people were disfigured for life. Several were blinded, and very many died, especially among the young. When it came, many died. And unlike the COVID, where, when they are old, they tend to die more than the young, but this was exactly the opposite. But people were disfigured, people were blinded, and it was one of the greatest scourges of its time. And for a very, very long period, there was no cure for it. It was, in fact, used as a weapon of biological warfare. As we all know, when the British landed in the new continent of America, smallpox blankets were one of the things that they gave the ethnic tribes, because those tribes had no immunity against smallpox. So blankets with smallpox in them would be given. They would get the sickness and then they would die. So this was one of the early instances of biological warfare. So you name it, it was used. So today, when we talk about whether this COVID virus came out of a bottle, it really didn't need to come out of a bottle in the case of smallpox, but it was put to good use in getting rid of enemies and so on and so forth. In India, certainly, it was known all over the country. And it was also considered to be the onset of smallpox would happen during the summer season. And therefore, it was believed that body heat was what really caused it. So in the north, you prayed to the goddess Shitala. And Shitala carries a broom in her hand and sits on a donkey. And you pray to this goddess. In the south, you prayed to Mahamayi. And she again was associated with the neem tree, which is a cooling agent. And Mahamayi itself comes from Mahamari. Mahamari being that which kills, which is essentially the smallpox. And it was believed that the goddess entered the body of the person who was ill, and the only cure was to keep applying neem leaves on the person, essentially to prevent them from scratching themselves and causing the pustules to spread further all around the body. And there was essentially nothing more that could be done about it, or at least that's what the world thought at that time. In 1796, we had a doctor in England called Dr. Edward Jenner, who for the first time realized that there were two kinds of, there was one kind of people who really did not get smallpox. And that was the people who tended to cows. And he found that the cowherds and the cowherdesses got an illness known as cowpox. And this cowpox came from small pustules that broke out in the udders of the cow. So when they milked the cow, the pustules would transfer themselves, the fluid would get onto the hands of the cowherds and the cowherdesses, and they would get an outbreak of cowpox in them, which was a very, very mild and containable version. And once they had got cowpox, they never got smallpox for quite some time, or they were fairly immune to smallpox. Having discovered this, Jenner then begins to extract the fluid that is in the pox of the cows and also in the hands of the cowherds and the cowherdesses. And he tries to inject people with it. Hardly anybody comes forward. So Jenner ends up injecting his own children. And once he does that, he proves that 2 years later that these children, though they were exposed heavily, and he went ahead and he exposed his children to people who had smallpox, the children remained immune. And it was thereafter that the treatment for the vaccination began to gain ground. The word vaccine and vaccination itself comes from the Latin vacca, which means cow. So essentially, the first vaccine in the world had been extracted from the udder of the cow, and that had come about as the smallpox vaccine, which in turn was going to be given to everybody in England. By 1898, the government in England decrees that everybody would have to get vaccinated for smallpox. Thereafter, Europe begins to encourage vaccination. All along during this time, the belief was that there was no other form of treatment that was happening for smallpox. What they did not know was that in Asia, and that included parts of India, it also included Turkey, it included China, there had been another kind of a treatment for vaccination and for smallpox, and that was called variolation. Variolation is where the dried pox from a patient would be taken and inhaled by people who wanted to be immune to smallpox. The other option was to extract the fluid that was in the pustules from the people who were ill, then have a set of scratches made on the hand where the flesh is exposed, and that flesh would come in contact with the fluid. After 7 days, a weakened form of smallpox would break out in the patient. Patient would then become fairly immune to the disease. The risk in this was it need not be a weakened form of smallpox. It could be a virulent form of smallpox that could break out in the variolated patient. The patient could die at the end of it. So there was a certain amount of risk. But the vaccination process that had been fine-tuned in England became the method that could be adopted everywhere. And soon the instructions came that the empire would also have to follow this kind of vaccination. See, at that time in the north, this variolation appears to have been, in fact, Andhra and northwards, variolation appears to have been a reasonably common practice, a method of preventing smallpox. But in the south, it was practically unheard of. And the general belief was wherever the army went on a march, smallpox would follow. One of the reasons for this is that armies essentially went out for battle during the summer season, and in the cold weather, they never went out during the rainy season. And it was not just the army that went, an entire town went along with the army, supplying everything from women to cooking to hairdressing to everything else, meat. And somewhere along wherever the camp went, you would find that smallpox would break out. In Tamil, the word for an army camp is Dand. And therefore, you will find even now around Madras city, lots of places where you have a Dandu Mariamman Tirukkovil. It essentially means that an army had camped there, smallpox had broken out, people had then propitiated the goddess Mariamman by putting up a temple for her. Even in Mylapore, you have it. You have a Dandu Mariamman temple. In Kodambakam, you have it. As far away, cantonment towns like Coimbatore, you have a Dandu Mariamman temple. So in various places, you will find it. And so it was to this locality that vaccination was going to arrive. The governor at that time was Edward, 2nd Lord Clive, the son of Robert Clive, the original rogue, ruffian, thief, swindler, whatever you can name it, the man who created the British Empire. In the eyes of the British, a great hero. We know what kind of a blackguard he was. His son was the governor of Madras at that time, whose portrait you see on the left. This is 1802. And the physician general at that time was Dr. James Anderson, who is also remembered for creating the first botanical garden in India in Nungambakam. Even today, Anderson's Road in Nungambakam commemorates this man, and he is buried in Madras in the St. Mary's cemetery on the island close to Central Station. So it was these two men who are now going to implement the vaccine. Before this, a small diversion as to how the vaccine actually traveled. It's all very well to say that, they shipped the vaccine. Now, how did they ship it? So it was called the arm-to-arm method of transferring the vaccine. So what they would do in England was they would extract the cowpox vaccine, dry it between 2 sheets of glass, and that specimen would travel by ship all the way to Iraq. That was the maximum distance up to which the vaccine would be live, after which it would be useless. There, it would be injected into the arm of a volunteer. It could be a woman, it could be a child, it could be a man who was traveling from England to India, and he or she would board the ship. And as soon as the infection broke out in them, that would be extracted and then given to the next person. So this arm to arm to arm to arm to arm, it would travel. Finally, whoever had it would land in Bombay. where there would be a set of volunteers waiting. They would be injected in turn, and then these volunteers would travel. They would go all over Tellicherry, Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, and from them the vaccine would be extracted. It would then go up to the princely states like Mysore. That was the only way in which the vaccine could travel. Today we talk about cold storage, supply chain, this, that, and sundry. In those days, the only supply chain was to ensure that all those people were living, and they brought the vaccine carrying it inside them. So the very first objection was, it is coming from lechas, people whom we technically consider untouchable. The white-skinned people are carrying vaccines inside them, which is then being transferred to Indians. So this by itself is a polluting problem. The second was that, advertisements had been put up telling people that this wonder cure for vaccine for smallpox had arrived. The word that they used for cowpox was gomari. They didn't know what was cowpox. There was no word for it. So somebody translated it saying, this is very good. Cow means go, and mari is pox. So let's call it komari or gaumari. Immediately the thing spread that this is extracted from dead cows. And therefore, this is an untouchable as far as we are concerned. We don't want to have anything to do with this form of treatment. Then came a further rumor that when they come to inject you, they will take down your name and address. This is essentially a ploy to find out where you are living, after which you will be served with a demand notice of tax. This is exactly like this whole thing about this CoWIN app, where, when you give your name and address, they tell you that if you vaccinated yourself or some such thing, it will reflect in your insurance records, and then your insurance premium will go up, and so on and so forth. There was this rumor for some time, if you remember. So this was exactly the kind of rumor that was being circulated at that time. So there were three stories. One is this is komari, which comes from cows. The other is that it's a mlecha, untouchable kind of a vaccine, which comes from the bodies of untouchables, and therefore it's meant to pollute you. And the third is that this was a method that the government was trying to, kind of get into your private lives, find out where you live and things like that. And later on, they will use it for good purpose for themselves. So the doctors, the British doctors who were here, they were completely at their wits' end as to how they were going to convince people. And in this, there are statistics available as to what was the reaction among the Brahmins, what was the reaction among the Muslims, what was the reaction among the so-called outcasts, what was it among the Christians, and so on. And you find that the Muslim community was, in the forefront of objecting to it. The Brahmins were also in the forefront of objecting to it. So there was even a caste-wise divide that was done to find out. By and large, people were negative as far as this vaccination was concerned. And that is when they decide that they'll have to get Indians to be involved in the vaccination program. So they zero in on a few Indians who had already been involved in medical service wherever the army went. And one of them was this man, W.S. Swaminayak. Swaminayak was born in 1768. And in the late 1780s, he joined the British Army. His elder brother, Guruappa Nayak, had been a Subedar in the army, and so he also joined it. He was not a soldier. He joined as a native dresser, a medical attendant. So whenever there would be warfare and sepoys would be injured by bullets or cannonballs and all that, he would go and he would treat them, ensure that they were in comfort till they died. Some of them would survive, and so on and so forth. Gradually, his reputation spread, and then, he also began to create some native medicines. I think all of us remember a time when we fell ill and we would go to a doctor who would give us a mixture, a colored liquid with a little diamond-shaped mark to indicate how much we had to have every day. And it would taste horrible, but at the end of the day, when we were cured, we were very thankful for whatever it was. So he was also creating medicines like this, and the public referred to him as Dr. Swaminayak. So Swaminayak was employed as a vaccinator. He was one of several vaccinators. But what made this particular man stand out was the fact that he was very good at communication, and he was very good at convincing people that they needed to get the vaccination done. And whether he did it because he was inspired by Edward Jenner, or whether he did it just out of happenstance, we don't know. He injected his own children and his kinsmen first to prove to everybody that this is not some outcast of a medicine, this is not Gomari, and it does bestow on the people a cure against smallpox. And that was the first step. Secondly, he began organizing vaccination camps at various places. And he would go along with his superior, Dr. J. Dalton. Dalton later would go on to found the Institute of Mental Health in Kilpauk, the hospital that this year, or 2 years ago, completed 225 years. And Dalton and he would go to various places. In Thiruvattriyur, when they went, in Thiruvallur, Thiruvattriyur and all that, there was a lot of hostility. And at one of these places, the public attacked the camp in which Dalton was staying and set fire to it. Dalton had to flee. But Swaminayak did not run away. He stood his ground. He ensured that the people came forward and got vaccinated. In Georgetown, a group of Armenians kidnapped him just before he set out for a vaccination camp, held him hostage for a couple of days, relieved him of his earrings and all that. And then it was only after some negotiation that he was finally released. He came back and he continued with the vaccination. This is the time that the government introduces an incentive scheme for the vaccinators. So this is exactly like what the corporation workers today are getting for going and identifying COVID cases. The more number of COVID cases they find out, the more money they get at the end of the day. So Swaminayak was one of the foremost in getting rewards because he could identify, or he could go, he could convince several people to come forward and get the vaccination done. This was one thing. The other was that today you find news items like Udayanidhi Stalin is giving away oil, food, rice, and small condiments, bags of condiments to people who come to vaccination camps. Similarly, in those days, the government began giving bags of rice to entice people to come to get vaccinated. So all of this begins to play a role, and eventually the vaccination begins to take hold among the public. Of course, the numbers are pathetically small when you look at the statistics of that time. When they have vaccinated 10,000 or 20,000 people, they consider it a great record. Even for those times, those numbers are very small. But a beginning had been made, and the vaccination, as and when the medicines were coming, some people were voluntarily coming forward to getting vaccinated. And then it was a very long process because this vaccine that was administered by Swaminayak and his people, that was not a lifelong vaccination. You had to get booster shots done after 5-6 years. People came to realize that eventually the vaccine technology kept improving. It was a long time before vaccination would finally become the cure for smallpox. But in his time, the government was greatly beholden to Swaminayak. So successive governors of Madras, they gave him rich rewards. One of them gave him a couple of gold bangles, and then he was given a silver palanquin and an allowance for bearers to carry him around in the silver palanquin wherever he went. He became the chief vaccinator of Madras presidency. And finally, in 1828, after a long service with great, very rewarding service, he finally retires and continues living in his house, of which we have a pen and ink sketch done in his lifetime. And this was in a place called Komalishwaranpet. This is the Pudupet of today. The Pudupet where you have the spare parts, automobile spare parts market. And in those days, that was the aristocratic quarter of Madras. It was on the banks of the river Kuvam that you see over here. The Kuvam at this point suddenly makes a turn towards the north. It is what is called an Uttaravahini, and therefore it becomes a very holy place like Banaras, where the Ganga takes a turn to the north. And all the aristocrats of Madras preferred to live on the banks of this river. This is in the 19th century, first half of the 19th century. And they also built a temple for Shiva, which still stands, Shiva as Komalishwara in Komalishwaranpet. And Swaminayak's house was exactly opposite this particular building, this particular structure. Down a street and then the main road and then on the opposite side. His neighbor was Pachepa Mudaliar, among the richest Dubashas of the East India Company, of whom a story should be said sometime, but He was the man whose will would eventually go towards funding all the educational institutions, beginning with Pachepa's College and Pachepa School and several other things. So he was a neighbor. And so this was the aristocratic quarter of Madras where Swaminayak lived. And eventually in 1841, Swaminayak passes away. His descendants continue to live in the same locality. And one of them in the 1960s was the judge of the High Court of Madras, W.S. Krishnaswamy Naidu. Incidentally, the W and the S, W.S. Swaminayak, W.S. Krishnaswamy Naidu, Udayagiri, Singadivakam, Krishnaswamy Nayak. Singadivakam is just on the outskirts of the city. And Swaminayak was given a village as a perpetual land holding. He became the Shrotriyamdar of the village of Oothukadu, which is just next to Singadivakam. So he called himself W. Woodiyagiri Singadivakam in the old English spelling, Swaminayak. And so his descendant was W.S. Krishnaswamy Naidu, who was a judge of the High Court of Madras. In 1963, Krishnaswamy Naidu separates a part of the property and creates a public park in it and builds a monument for his ancestor who made vaccination a success in this city. And V.V. Giri, who was then the Vice President of India, comes to inaugurate that particular obelisk, which pays tribute to Swaminayak. Behind it, you can see the old house, Venkatabag, in which the family lived. And this was the portion that was fronting it. This still stands today on Adityanar Sale, Harris Road, which is just near the river Kuvam, and you can still see the obelisk that stands. Of course, behind it, the old house is gone and it's been replaced by a multi-storied building and all that. But the monument to that pioneering vaccinator is still there in this city. Without him, the mind boggles as to how we would have reacted, what would have happened. But it is very interesting to note that smallpox is the only virus to have been eradicated till now. All the other viruses are happily going around the world. Of course, it fills us with a great fear when we are all having hopes that the COVID virus will one day be eradicated. But what began with Jenner and with Swaminayak is finally concluded in our city. I must bring you to the end of the story. Swaminayak passes away in 1841. Vaccination continues. In 1899, we get our own vaccine manufacturing facility, and that is put up in Madras. And that is the King Institute in Guindy, named after Colonel W.G. King of the Indian Medical Service. And this is from where vaccines then spread out to the rest of the country. Today, this still remains a place where COVID patients are being treated. And there is also talk about building a multi-super specialty hospital next to it in the vast grounds that surround this particular institution in Guindy, Saidapet. Now, from here, the vaccines go all around and people are continuing to be vaccinated. But till the 1960s, India is one of the smallpox-prone countries of the world, and Madras city remained a smallpox capital of the world. It contributed to some of the most alarming statistics in smallpox casualties right up to the 1960s. At that time, we had a doctor, Dr. Ayyagari Ramachandra Rao, who was the superintendent of the Communicable Diseases Hospital in Thondayarpet, a corporation-run facility. This was the man who does a statistical analysis of the waves in which the smallpox breaks out. Today, we talk about waves in COVID. Identical study. And he identifies that the smallpox comes in 3 waves. The first wave is the most intense. Thankfully, unlike COVID, it happened in annual waves. So if in a year there were maximum casualties, you would be well prepared to know that in the next year it will be moderate, and third year it would be very light. And he also said that it is when it is very light that you need to intensify the vaccination process, because the next year is going to be an alarming breakout of smallpox. And having done that, he intensifies the vaccination program all over Madras city. And then he also, at his own risk, he comes up with a proposition. Internationally, the opinion was that infants could not be vaccinated with the smallpox vaccine because it had no effect on them. Dr. Ramachandra Rao was the one who said, If it had no effect, it doesn't matter. But we don't know if it will have some effect. And therefore, in the 1960s, he declared that all women having babies in government-run hospitals, and in those days, most of the hospitals were government-run, we must remember, they would get all the infants inoculated. He said there was going to be no sparing of the babies. If they die, it's okay, but let's find out what happens. When they inoculated the babies, the next year, they found not one of those infants died of smallpox. The World Health Organization took notice of what Madras had done. Dr. Ramchandra Rao was invited as a consultant to all the countries of the world where smallpox was still prevalent at that time. And that finally marked the end of smallpox as a disease. By the 1970s, it had been completely eradicated. And today, we don't hear of an outbreak of smallpox anywhere. So what Swaminayak really began, Dr. A. Ramchandra Rao finally completes. I'll end this presentation with just one small story. Sometime in 2013, I was desperately looking for a photograph of Dr. Ramchandra Rao. And the corporation was wanting a book. The book never came out eventually, but we needed a photograph of this man. Finally, we tracked the photograph down to somewhere high up in the ceiling in the Communicable Diseases Hospital. It had been eaten by whatever eats photographs. We have no idea, but the photograph existed in bits and pieces. And the then superintendent of the Communicable Diseases Hospital said, I'll give you permission to bring out that photograph and photograph it only if you take a photograph of me also. And in whatever you write, his photo and my photo must come next to each other. So we just wanted this photo, desperately. So we said, yeah, no problem. Give it. You also pose for it and all that. And so he posed. We got down this photograph. Then we took it back to the studio. We heavily photoshopped it. We had to get eyes and eyebrows and all done for whatever was left of Dr. Ramchandra Rao. And finally, anyway, the book never came out, but I wrote an article in the Hindu about him. And I very dutifully sent the other photo also. So I got a call from the editor saying, okay, we understand this is Dr. Ramchandra Rao. Who is this? So I said, well, he is the current superintendent. And he has told me that no matter what happens, whenever you write, you'll have to put him and me next to each other. So the matter got referred to N. Ram. N. Ram called me and said, I'm not going to carry that man's photo. Dr. Ramchandra Rao will be up in the newspaper, but not the other fellow. I said, what do I tell him? He said, you tell him N. Ram is a very evil man. He said, your photo cannot be published. And so that was the end of the story. The photo came out. 2 days later, I get a call from an old lady. She was the grandniece of Ramchandra Rao. And she tells me, sir, I could not recognize my uncle at all. What have you done with this photograph? I said, that was the only photograph I had. And I did all kinds of Photoshop to make him a human face. So she said, we also don't have any photographs. Let us assume that this is Dr. Ramchandra Rao. So with that, I take leave of this presentation. I'm open to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sriram.
Thank you.
As usual, you have kept us spellbound.
Thank you.
I think people were not even breathing. There was no noise of breathing coming out.
You muted everybody. So there was...
Okay, so we are open to questions.
So yes, one question from me. My name is Mathur from Annanagar. So as you said, do you think in your with all your research you have done and so much in-depth knowledge that you have, will there be an end to COVID?
My answer is as good as yours. I hope there will be, and I'm sure there will be eventually. How soon it happens is what we really need to watch out for.
Thank you.
Sriram, I have a question. Did you ever get a call from the superintendent that when after Hindu story appeared?
I was dreading that call, but it didn't come. I'm sure he must have been transferred or something by then. So.
Sriram, you are mentioning that it was a hand-to-hand transfer, in the ship and all that. But then those people who are getting infected, they could die, no?
No, they were getting cowpox, right?
Oh,
They
okay.
were
I'm
not
sorry.
getting
I'm
the
sorry.
smallpox.
Okay. So it was
So
cowpox. Okay.
they were getting, so they were not dying of cowpox.
Okay,
So
right.
it was fantastic, the kind of the where variolation failed was that it was transmitting smallpox, and so people could have died.
Yeah.
This was transmitting cowpox, and therefore it was not. But that was really a thrilling find about how they were actually transporting the vaccine.
Did
Sriram?
government did not make it compulsory for all to have vaccination?
Apparently, it was not made compulsory till a very long time.
But
in the
finally,
initial years-
even if somebody wanted to travel abroad,
Huh.
they got to give a certificate of having got the vaccination for traveling abroad.
See, but that is only from the 1900s onwards. In the 1800s and all that, this was
But
not.
I still remember as a school student, they used to, even though I had my smallpox vaccination as a child, they used to, in the school days, they used to come and then do the vaccination on the hand. It is a small one. But the earlier one was a bigger mark, even still remains on my shoulders. But later on, they used to make it as the small pouch. And there's no question this one. They will make compulsory. Students will start run away and then they will catch hold of them and then do the vaccination.
Yeah, Sriram, just one question, Sriram. Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm audible. Yeah. Okay. Where does this story of infertility come in? There's a lot of stories came about, inducing infertility in people who take those vaccines. And how did that story come about? Is it something to do with the emergency?
No. I think infertility is one of the most common fears that you can inject into anybody. In our college, I remember in the mess, we used to find that the SOMF was disappearing at alarming rates. So we spread the story among all the friends that, if you have SOMF, you can't get it up anymore. Pardon the language. And thereafter, the SOMF used to get returned in tons from the dining table. Nobody would touch it because that was a great fear among people. In my office last month, convincing people to go and get vaccinated, a 55-year-old man comes and tells me, I said, you already have children. What is your problem, man? No, all kinds of. So this is, I think, a very common fear among men.
There's a question in the chat box, actually. Yeah, I think it's from Ganga Priya. When did we shift from cowpox vaccine to attenuated smallpox vaccine as per Pasteur?
Pasteur himself post-dates Jenner by almost a century. Pasteur was during Queen Victoria's reign and during the second half of Queen Victoria's reign. That is the time when Joseph Lister, with his, evil revolutionary finding of antibiotics, and Pasteur. So that comes a good 40 to 50 years after Jenner's discovery. So we are looking at somewhere in the 1880s when we are talking about Pasteur.
Thank you.
Any more questions, please?
I have something to say, Ranjit. Do I have your permission?
Sure. Please go ahead.
Being the former director of King Institute, there is still a little building there. We used to call it the hut. Yeah. And that was the first vaccine depot there. It's a round circular building, built in 1890 sometime. And it was used as a smallpox vaccine depot. It was from there that the vaccines were distributed. And after that, King Institute started manufacturing the vaccine. And I think sometime in 1980, they stopped the production, of course, when the eradication was certified. But I think you should go and take a look at that little building. It still stands there.
Actually, I've been there. It's just that, I've lost several of the photographs that I have taken, and one of them was of the hut. So, now there was no question of going back there to take the photo. When I put this presentation,
pass it on to you, Sriram, sometime. I do have it.
You have it? I'll be very grateful if you can pass it on.
Sriram, there is another question from Balu. It says, when did the oral drop version come about?
It must have happened much later, sometime, I don't know, because see, as I said, the vaccine was a kind of work in progress. They kept refining it and refining it and refining it. So this must have come about sometime in the last century before the eradication. Not very sure of that.
Okay. And
I remember
Rotarian
one thing.
Parimala has a question.
I got one question.
Okay,
Hello?
please, Rotarian Ramalingam, please go ahead.
Yeah, no. You know that water is responsible for so many diseases, and it should have been very much worse at that time. What was the condition of the Kuvam River, sir, which was flowing through the city?
The Kuvam was a clean river till the 1840s, after which it became a degenerated river. There's no use in flagellating ourselves alone for it. It was bad during the English times as well, and it has just grown worse during our time. But till the 1840s or so, it was a reasonably clean river.
Thank you, Sriram. Sandy, the next question is from Sandy. Please go ahead, Sandy.
Sriram, this is a question on, linking this all back to Rotary. What was do you have any idea of what the response to the polio plus program was? Was it similar? Was there similar kind of fears? How did that happen, and how did the Rotary experience those kinds of things, and how did we deal with it?
Fabulous question, Sandy. I wish I had an answer for it, but it's so interesting that you should bring it up. It's really worth a study, finding out, what the reaction to polio vaccines were. Today, we just take it for granted, but it's a fabulous question. I wish I had an answer for that.
Thank you, Sri. Answer for that. They didn't have much of a resistance down south, but there was a lot of resistance in the north, especially to certain communities, for taking the oral polio vaccine. They thought that it will make them infertile or whatever. So there was a lot of resistance, but down south, we didn't face so much of resistance, except from, the high-rise buildings or those who are living in the elite society. They were resistant to take the pulse polio. I think even now, we find it difficult to have a pulse polio program in such communities. And in fact, Tamil Nadu was the first state to almost eradicate polio at that time. And in the north, of course, we had a lot of resistance, and we had to go into the houses with the armed people, guarding us when we do the immunization. That was the kind of resistance that was there. But finally, we are very happy that India is not has eradicated polio, but we must make sure that it doesn't come back again.
Thank you, Nalini. Parimala, Rotarian Parimala has got a question.
Yes, sir. Good evening, Sriram, sir. Wonderful topic, sir. Spellbound with your narration. I have just one doubt. I saw the statue of Swaminayak. How did the prefix doctor come, sir? With him
even in his lifetime, he was calling himself Dr. Swaminayak, and native doctor.
Okay.
Thank you, Sriram. Now over to Chitra. You have a question, Chitra Mugundan, Rotarian.
Yeah, good evening to all of you. Wonderful insight. But the thing is, I got a little bit of a net issue, so I don't know whether this has been covered, but I just would like to know if there's something called the monkeypox, Something.
No, I didn't cover that. In fact, I'd be happy to know what that is.
Yeah. I think it's similar to cowpox and smallpox, is it right?
No idea.
Yeah, I think Sriram is not sure about it. Anyway, we have the recording of this, and this will be mailed to you. I'll send it to you, Renu, and you can give it to your friends. It's worth watching it again because lots of dates, you have given lots of milestones Sriram has given us, so we'll have to have a rerun to understand it better. So if there are no more questions, we will close the meeting. Any more questions?
One more I have now in a second. Sriram, I wanted to know, see, these days, one of the challenges we have with vaccination is mass production for a huge population for our country. Now, we have crores and crores of vials required to vaccinate the entire population. How was it tackled during that time? Is there any history about how the vaccine was produced, and then how long it took to really cover the entire population at that point of time.
Only from the 1880s that you find that there is talk of mass production and transport of vaccine. Till that time, it continued like this. And then, of course, as I mentioned to you, from 1899, King Institute begins to make it here by itself. But you must remember that the population was not what it is now. That was a very important factor. We are looking at, a population that was far, far lower as compared to what, just to give you a scale, Chennai's population till 1943 was 6 lakhs. And today we are talking about 1 crore and plus. In 80 years, the population has increased to such an extent. So just scale it down and you will get an idea as to if you look at Subramanya Bharati's, what is that song? It is 20 Kodi Janangal in Sangam. The country is only 20 crores at that time. Bharati died in 1920 or 1990. So it actually, the original is only 20 Kodi, then it becomes 30 Kodi, and then I remember D.K. Jayaraman in his car, when he would sing it, he would keep increasing it line by line, 60 Kodi, 70 Kodi, 80 Kodi, Janangal in Sangam. He would keep increasing every line, just to show the way so the numbers were far more manageable. Of course, infrastructure was that much backward. There is no doubt about it.
Okay, thank you, Sriram. I think we have come to the end of an excellent presentation. Another excellent presentation with Sriram. Thanks a lot for taking time off during a busy month and being with us. I would request President Renu to propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you, President Ranjit. It's my pleasure, but I would really like to thank V Sriram sir for taking out his valuable time today. And the story of smallpox was mesmerizing. The lesser known facts on the vaccination were especially enlightening, and how I was especially mesmerized with the arm-to-arm method. I did not even know it existed. My God, that was amazing. I would also like to, and back in the days also, I believe there were difficulties in convincing people. So I think we still have those difficulties now also. Swaminayak, the story of Swaminayak was very enlightening. He was a good communicator. So communication plays a very important role, as we can see, definitely. So great, and thank you so much, sir. It was a wonderful journey of the smallpox vaccination and the whole story about it. I did not know Chennai, Madras was the smallpox capital of the world. But yes, I would also like to thank Sandilia, who introduced you, Secretaries Jyoti Lakshmi and Lekha for the announcements. I'm grateful to all of you present here today, and especially my club members at such a short notice. Thank you all for being present here and listening to Sriram V and all the lesser known facts about vaccination. With that, I once again would like to thank Rotarian Ranjit Joseph for giving us the opportunity, me and my club members, for giving us this opportunity to have the joint speaker meet today. Thank you, President Ranjit.
So let's officially close the meeting.
Yes.
This meeting of the Rotary Club of Madras South is adjourned.
This meeting of the Rotary Club of Anna Nagar Madras is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, members of